Hello, everyone. I'm Margaret Carney, and I'm director and curator of the International Museum of Dinnerware Design. We're so glad that you're with us this evening. We've got a fantastic talk by Rolf Achilles, but I'm going to do a few housekeeping things first. First, I want to thank the Ann Arbor District Library for co-hosting this event with us this evening, and I want to thank all of you for attending. This will be recorded, so you can hear it again later if you want to. And I have a few little other things I want to say as usual. If you haven't gotten our newsletter in the mail, the one with the big centerfold of TEPCO Confucius on it, I see Rolf has it, so we're good.
It came in the mail today.
Thank you. I haven't mailed all of them, so yours might still be in the mail, or you didn't renew your membership and you're not getting it because you didn't renew. But it's a really great issue this time. My other announcement is, before I introduce Rolf, is we have a speaker a month from now, which is timely with our exhibition Entomophagous Dining, which opens on April 8th at the Washtenaw County Historical Society's Museum on Main Street. I'm opening up the newsletter because if you had one, you'd see the big blurb on it. And it opens April 8th. It runs through the end of August. It's a juried and invitational exhibition. It's the fifth that we've had of these biennial national exhibitions. I want to thank the Washtenaw County Historical Society's Museum on Main Street for co-hosting that and their partnership with us. And then the speaker next month, before we get started this month, is on April 8th, and April 12th. So mark your calendar, you'll get notices, of course. And the title of Gina Hunter, who's a cultural anthropologist, her talk, which is befitting our entomophagous dining, which is eating insects, if you're flipping through your dictionary right now. Her topic is Insect Foods, Back to the Future, ? She wrote a book in 2021 called Edible Insects, A Global History, and I won't say anything more about that. So I assume if you're here tonight, you've read all about Rolf Achilles and what an accomplished scholar he is. He's one of the world's authorities on historian on researching German mass-produced airbrushed ceramics from 1936 onward, 28 onward. And I'm not going to tell you too much more about it. I love the title of the talk. What is more interesting than something called Degenerate Dinnerware? What can that be? And I always like to show something from our collection. And this is appallingly tiny and simple, but it's one of like two examples in our whole Dinnerware Museum collection of a German airbrushed little pitcher. And yes, it really is as tiny as I'm holding it here. Rolf's going to show you some wonderful, better images. But I'm going to turn it over to you, Rolf, right now, because I don't want to waste any more precious moments, and I'm dying to hear your talk. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for that great introduction. Precious moments is appropriate for this, because the Degenerate Dinnerware was an interesting development that happened in Germany and elsewhere at the time, Germany and Austria. It has to do with airbrush technology, and airbrush technology, that is the use of an airbrush to put very thin coats of pigment on something, developed in the United States in the later 19th century. In 1879, there was the first one copyrighted. It was called a little spray machine. Nobody produced it. And then a couple of years later, another one was produced, and that became known as an aerograph. And then in 1892, a fellow in Rockford, Illinois, developed a machine that was like a pen with a little ink, with a little container on it that held pigment. And with some air pressure, it would spray out a fine mist of whatever was in that container. And a company in Chicago bought him or hired him, and he then brought his patented device with him. They then had an exhibit. The company in Chicago had an exhibit at the 1893 World's Fair and left the developer who had the patent on it out of the exhibit. He got miffed and had signed an agreement that the company had rights in the United States, but not in the rest of the world for their product. So what does he do in 1894? He moves to London with his idea, and he sets up a little company there. And by 1900, Mr. Burdick, that's his name, he was from Rockford, Illinois, and his name is Charles Burdick. He sets up a company in London in 1900 that he calls the Aerograph Company. And designers of posters and the ceramics industry on the continent are especially taken by his technology, because what it does is put on a micro thin layer of pigment onto a surface. It's enormously cost effective. And in the ceramics industry, where everything was hand painted before, mostly hand painted before this, you needed skilled artists. Now, suddenly you didn't need the highly skilled artist who could paint a flower or a tree or something. And you could end up doing paintings like this with your aerograph and a stencil. You didn't need highly skilled craftsmen. It was enormously cost effective. And in Germany, and as you know, after World War I, Germany had all sorts of economic problems because of treaties and paybacks and so forth. They had hyperinflation. We complain about inflation running at 5, 6, 8% a year. In Germany, it was running at about 2,000 to 5,000 times a month. And they printed money galore, and it cost 1 billion German marks to buy a loaf of bread and to buy one of these plates. But the ceramics companies survived the war, and they survived the war, and they survived into the 1920s, making what was considered modernist at the time. And what's fascinating about the two plates that you're looking at here, the one, they were produced by the company of Kollwitz and Zernowitz Meissen, and they show a wedge and the like, and wedges and circles, and they're not abstract, they're non-objective. This is not looking at nature and making an abstraction of it. This is just coming up with a geometric form of some kind that is not a natural form. And this is something that the Russians developed, like Malevich and others. You can see the Malevich painting on the left. This is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and I just picked one called the Airplane Flying. Of course, you can all see the airplane in that picture on the left, the yellow lines, the red lines, the black lines. It's non-objective, and it's suprematist he called it his work suprematist. And the Germans liked it because it didn't take a lot of skill to actually paint the flower and so forth. You could just make a stencil and reproduce this. Then there's Kandinsky in the upper center. He was at the Bauhaus from 1922 to 1933. And his studio companion at the Bauhaus was Paul Klee, whom I'm not showing you a picture of. But you know, later Kandinsky, he went from landscape painting to these kinds of all sorts of lines and circles and squares, and he used the airbrush. And the one at the bottom of the picture with the red wedge in it is by L. Lissitzky, another Russian. L. Lissitzky's print is world famous, and it's called Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge. The whites, of course, are the circle, and the red wedge is the Soviet circle beating, it's the red Russians versus the white Russians and so forth. And then on the right, you can see a painting by Robert Delaunay, which is in the Pompidou Center. Delaunay did a lot of broken circles and other non-objective imagery, along with his wife, Sonia. And they're sort of the ones behind this all in the between 1912 to about 1922, 23. And the result of this interesting European, Soviet-inspired, French-inspired, non-objective. Americans didn't go for non-objective. They didn't. They liked to see trees and apples and so forth. But the Europeans were looking for new things to do. And the plate on the left is by the company Zell, Z-E-L-L, and the one on the right is by Karlsruhe. The one on the left is attributed to L. Lissitzky. Now, he may or may not have ever designed for a German company, but L. Lissitzky lived in Berlin from 1921 on for a couple of years, and he was very influential in Germany. And he spoke fluent German. So he got out of the Soviet Union and continued his work there. He then went back and so forth. But others were and that's how these influences traveled from the Soviet Union. The French were also in Germany, but the Germans were the ones that really made this decoration. There was also this decoration, this type of decoration was popular in Czechoslovakia, which was a new country in 1918. So they wanted a new look, and they went for airbrushed, geometric, non-objective imagery. The Czechs did. And then in Portugal, there was also a great movement of this kind of painting. And in the course of time, I've gotten interested in the non-objective, mass-produced, everyday wear that's industrialized. I'm not interested in hand-painted. That's a whole different class of collecting. So what you're going to see tonight is really all industrial product. It's stencil, it's airbrush, it's machine, non-objective design. There is no nature behind any of this. Just a lot of intelligence and intellectual activity that you could industrialize. Such as these two pieces. They're from Bunzlau, which is now in Poland. Bunzlau is Bolec Wiecz, I think, something like that. And the one on the left is a butter dish, and it's from 1929, 1930. And the little picture on the right is also from about 1929, 1930. And it was in Bunzlau that the first academic school was set up that taught airbrush. And they taught how to use the machines. They helped them develop the machines and develop the patterns. And from this early Bunzlau education, it went to the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus, you know, in Germany started in 1919. It's closed in 1933. It never used airbrush technology, but it liked the forms that airbrush technology was interested in creating. And the Bunzlau teacher went to the Bauhaus and became the ceramics instructor there. Now, these are two jugs produced by a very important company called Karstens. Christian Karsten and his family were great ceramists in companies. They didn't make ceramics themselves personally, but they had companies, and they ran a big conglomerate company. Karstens and Villeroy and Boch become the two largest ceramic companies in the world in the 1920s and into the 1930s. Americans didn't have large companies in comparison, resulting in Germany and then Czechoslovakia becoming the two countries that had the world's largest production of ceramics from about 1927, 28 until about 1936, 38. And the Germans and the Czechs really went for the modernist look of non-objective. As you can see here, these two jugs from Karstens. Karstens is a company, this is Karstens Georgenthal, one of their subsidiaries. It's in Thuringia. And the designs are done by a woman named Maria Piffel, P-I-F-F-L. Piffel is not a household name in the United States, but she was an enormously influential designer in Germany. And she disappears about 1935, 36, and there's no biography of her later than that. But she was involved in Karstens in 1930 to 35. And these two patterns here are some of her examples. Now, another important company in Germany that we know very little about, and we don't know who the artists generally are that made these or the designs, is the Steingut, the stoneware factory of Grünstadt. Grünstadt is in the Pfalz. It's in another state in Germany. It's in the city of Grünstadt. And they did the most remarkable cake platters and the most remarkable designs. This is all stencil ware. The pricing was reasonable. These were enormously popular in the early 1930s, and it all came to a screeching halt sort of by 1934, 35. There's lots of politics involved because these are thought to be Soviet inspired. One could almost see a parallel to what's happening in parts of the world this very day. But Steingut Grünstadt, and you can see the different patterns and forms that platters came in. These were cake platters. Now, many of them don't have any scratches on them, so you can sort of wonder, like, who served anything on these? Well, probably not. The ones I'm interested in are almost always in mint condition. And one of the pieces of resistance, one of the great objects, is by Villeroy and Boch. They're still making sinks and dinnerware and all sorts of things. They're based in Mettlach today, which is in the French occupied Saar region of Western Germany. And this is we don't know who the designer is, but it's a punch bowl. It came in, there's one green one known and one red one known. This is the red one. It also came with a little sugar container and probably some mugs, but those have never shown up anywhere, and nobody knows other than from a photograph of 1932 or so that existed. And we don't know if they came in any other colors other than red and green, because there's only two that survive in the world. Can you imagine? These were mass produced and only two survived. One's in Germany and one's here. One of my favorite little boxes is made by cookie boxes. You put your cookies and crackers and things in this box. It's ceramic. It's always stoneware. It's hard, airbrushed glaze and patterns on it. This is done. We don't know who the designer and the decorator is of this box from Karsten Elmshorn. I'm sorry. That was another subsidiary of Karsten's. And Elmshorn is in Schleswig-Holstein. It's up north of Hamburg, near the Danish border in Germany. And little is known about these companies. The reason is World War II took an enormous toll on these companies, and many of their inventories were smashed in 1936 because the German government, the legitimate government that had come into power, the National Socialists in 1933, passed a law making all sorts of art degenerate, whether it's jazz, whether it was books, whether it was dancing. It was all part, and paintings especially, and we know a lot about the paintings, the prints, the books. We know nothing about the other element that was declared degenerate, and that was ceramics and glass. And that's also what interests me, is why don't we include ceramics when we talk about paintings? Or can we only focus on one thing at a time? So this kind of pot, there's only a few of these that have survived. They influenced the Portuguese, for example, a lot, that had a vital industry. And then in Germany, again, there's a company called Hale, H-A-E, with two dots on it, L, and it was a ceramic company outside of Berlin in Malwitz, by Felten Vordam, founded 1923 by a student from the Bauhaus, Margaret Marks, M-A-R-K-S. She's also known as Margaret Hyman Marks. She was born in 1899 and dies in London in 1990. She was Jewish and had great difficulty starting in about 1932 keeping her company afloat. And this is one of the pieces, one of the latter pieces produced in 1932, 33, just before she sold the company. And she sold the company to a fellow German, but not a Jewish German, named Bollhagen. And that company survived for many years and even paid her royalties using, under the National Socialist regime, they were still using Margaret Wildenhain's Marx's forms, just not her decoration on the forms. So many of these degenerate forms survived until the late 1930s. Another very important woman designer in the scheme of things is this one that worked in Karlsruhe, and it's Mata Ketzer, K-A-T-Z-E-R, K-A-T-Z-E-R. Another woman who's completely unknown in the US, but the Cooper Hewitt has a bowl like the one on the upper left and the one in the upper center. And I'm showing you the bottom of the bowl, and then another cake platter that she designed with these non-objective forms, and then the Karlsruhe manufacturing mark, their number and decoration and so forth. And you can see the name Germany. Whenever Germany shows up on one of these ceramics from 1930, 31, 32, it was for export. Now, we don't know where it went, but they do show up on the art market today, occasionally. Another company, and there were about 95 some companies in Germany that were producing airbrush. You're going to see maybe a dozen, 15 of them today, is Annaburg, and they had a subsidiary. There's Annaburg, and then there's Annaburg Untucht. And Untucht did the more radical platters and other things. And as you can see, this cake platter on the left, which is a superb example with airbrush technique, also has a spatula. Can you imagine a ceramics spatula? They must have broken after 3 slices of cake. But here it is, same pattern. You also see the bottom of the cake platter. It stood up about 3 inches on this hollowed ring. It was a very strange configuration, and a number of these have survived, but not many. And they came with a couple different patterns that I'm aware of. So again, more cake platters. I like cake platters. They're also probably the most popular production item of the German airbrushed ceramics industry. The 2 on the left, the one with the yellow angles and the blue crosses and the dots, they're by a company named Kolditz, which is from the city of Kolditz, C-O-L-D-I-T-Z, from about 1930-31. And then a very rare one, the lower one with the 2 little guys. And you can see they're airbrushed, a little airbrushed pants, a little circular body. They've got little wedgy arms and little round heads and so forth. There are not very many airbrushed figures on airbrushed ceramics. This took a certain amount of technical skill to produce, but here we see them on a 1931 or so platter. The platter in the middle, looking very much like the platter in the upper left, is by the company Staffel, S-T-A-F-F-E-L. They're from Hessen, just north of Frankfurt in Germany, 1931 again. And you can see how one company starts using the shapes of another company. This happens, making it very confusing nowadays if the object isn't signed, and not all ceramics are signed. And the 2 on the left are Kolditz again. You can see this zigzag pattern on a platter and on a cookie box, a container. The Russians have a couple of examples of this, and there was a big show in the Guggenheim showing these pieces a number of years ago, and they said they were Russian designs and they had a Russian name and everything. But if you go to the Kolditz, fortunately, through World War II, still has their original pattern books. And this pattern is a number in their pattern books. So we know that Kolditz produced it. There's no artist attributed to it or anything. If they had had a foreign artist, they would have mentioned it, because they do mention other artists with names. So this is probably not a Russian thing. Dishes, saucers, cups, and so forth, extremely popular And here you see a number of them, showing you Lehmann. That's the C.A. Lehmann of Kala, K-A-H-L-A, the name of the town that these were manufactured in, the upper zone. Kala still exists. It's still a ceramic center. They have a big factory. You can go there and enjoy it. The cups in the bottom are by Annaberg, and it's 1931, the set. And when I show you one set like this, I usually have the teapots and the platters and everything that goes together. But I didn't want to fill up the pictures too much. As you can see, the cups are really interesting. This is stoneware. It's not porcelain. It's stoneware. And the cup is maybe at its lip, it's like a 32nd of an inch thick. The body of the cup is maybe a 16th of an inch thick. So the Germans developed technology that made extremely thin stoneware. And by putting a hard glaze on it, it was functioning and survived. You can bang these pretty hard without breaking them. I know from experience. Now, the name you all are familiar with is Eva Zeisel. Eva Zeisel, of course, in America, very famous from the 1942 exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, and lived to the age of 102, just died a few years ago. But Eva was known as Eva Stricker. She was from Budapest, and one of her first businesses she worked with and designed for was Karsten's Hirschau in 1930. And this is cake platter of hers. There's also cups and pots and so forth. And you can see the mark of Hirschau. It's a little Hirsch, which is a deer. And then another one of her works, of Eva Zeisel's, Stricker Zeisel's works, was a round ball-like dinner service called the Century Service. And it was in production from 1932-33, even though she wasn't at Hirschau anymore. They still continued her production. And this is a creamer that she designed. And notice the handle. It looks like an ear. And that's one of her trademarks in the early 1930s. From here, she worked in Lübeck. She worked in Hamburg for a little bit. We don't know any of the designs from there really, and then from there, she went to the Soviet Union, and Stalin put her in a gulag, and she escaped from that gulag. She had run the Soviet's porcelain industry for 6 months, 8 months, or a year. And so that's a whole other story. Pitchers to hold cocoa, pitchers to hold apple cider were extremely popular with airbrushed ceramics on them. And you can see a number of them here. These pitchers are cocoa pitchers, all of them. Cocoa was a new thing. You didn't have to melt the bar of chocolate to get chocolate milk. You had a pulverized cocoa like we do today, and you just put it in hot milk, and you end up with cocoa. And the hot milk you put in one of these containers. It has a lid on it. The lid has a sieve in the front so that any little lumps that you might have get caught in it. But the decoration usually goes along with plates and with a whole dinner service. And there were even tablecloths with the same color palette, so that the brown one at the your upper left-hand corner could be also a tablecloth. And I have a number of tablecloths that fit these patterns. So it's an integrated collection. The one in the bottom left, again, it's from Elsterwerda. It's from 1934-35. And so even after the National Socialists came into power, there were still companies creating new designs. And the one on the right is by Karsten's Gräfenrode. There's about 45 or 50 different cocoa pots that they did, each with a number of different patterns on them. And the one I'm showing you here has those little ridges at the bottom left. Those were the drip catchers, so that if the drop ran down the front of the pot, it got caught in there, and you wouldn't have a drip on your tablecloth. It doesn't work, but it's a really cool design. An anonymous company, we don't know who this company is, but these are cider containers, cider pitchers, and with lid, as you can see, without a lid. They were for export because they're marked to Germany, but we don't know anything about them. They're airbrushed with sponge pattern to get the large pointy ones, and the circles are airbrushed. So interesting combinations. Bowls of all different kinds, inside, outside decoration. You can see the Villeroy and Boch bowl on the left with the blue Maltese cross in it. It's from about 1930-31, made in Mettlach. The center bowl is from Annaberg, also 1930-31. And there's a whole dinner service that goes with this bowl. And on the right, another Villeroy and Boch one. This time it's from Dresden. Dresden had a major ceramics industry before World War II until about 1938. It's not advancing. Oh, okay. Dinnerware also came in different shapes. Karsten Ufrecht, for example, developed in 1929 these triangular plates. These are little dessert plates. You can put whatever it is on them. And then the elliptical bowl is also from Karsten Ufrecht. Again, 1929, 1930 production. And then a napkin holder. Of course, you had cloth napkins, not paper napkins. So you could fit one cloth napkin into each side of this container. These were quite popular. And as you can see, they have non-objective decoration on them that's airbrushed. Teapots of all different kinds were popular. This is a very well-known pattern with decoration 252 from 1931, 1933. You can see it's sort of dynamic with a lid handle that goes off to at an angle. It has a pointy handle, which is hard to hold. The pot is relatively heavy. So you can't use, it's not convenient to use, but much more convenient and more balanced is this one from Annaberg Untucht. And I show you the teapot in the upper left, the cookie container that goes with the teapot on the lower left, and then the cup and saucer and a plate on the right side. This is extremely thin-walled stoneware. It's amazing that any of this survived, especially after 1936. Here's another Annaberg Untucht, this dot pattern on the cup and saucer and on a spatula. There's also a cake platter and so forth with all these patterns on it. And then you see the Untucht mark on the right. And the number that you see below, that's the decoration number. One of my favorite pieces is this large one that a cake platter and the like. It's from Rössler, R-O-E-S-L-E-R. They had two factories, one in Coburg and one in Darmstadt. And this is part of their Coburg production. I love this pattern. You see the wedge coming in, there's a circle, and the circles are also on the coffee pot in the upper left and on the cookie box, but the lid at the bottom has the wedges again. And so they're all the same pattern, stenciled in different sizes and different proportions on different objects. No, it doesn't want to advance. Funny that. Oh. Bowls of all different kinds again. And this one is by Karstens. On the left, the spiral, it's design. The sieve sieves were very popular out of ceramics. This is kitchenware. And I've tried using these. They don't work very well, but they're not like a metal sieve, but they do work, and it keeps, you put a plate underneath it and you can put something damp in there and it'll drip out slowly. But they keep the same airbrushed patterns in them that the regular bowls have, and then another bowl at the top and an unidentified plate on the right. And then comes condiment bowls, containers, all sorts of things to put on the middle of a table. You can put nuts and cookies or whatever you want, any small edibles in these containers. There aren't that many of these around. You never see them much. But also, and this is by a company that was extremely popular in the United States. It's called Wächtersbach. Many of you may recognize Wächtersbach because they were popular for Christmas mugs and Christmas tree ornaments and the like in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, also in the 1930s. But the Americans always bought them, didn't buy these non-objective decorated objects. They wanted little girls in dindles and little boys in lederhosen and trees and so forth, something recognizable, more like Norman Rockwell would approve of. So Wächtersbach did this abstraction, non-objective, and the others at the same time, but so did all the other companies. I'm just not interested in them. Another condiment dish, a really nice one, a complicated one on the left. And on the right, these are both by Annaberg. And it's interesting to see how you can airbrush into a curved surface or just the large breaking up of the surface on the cake platter on the right. It's very much like a Sonia Delaunay fabric or her husband's fabric designs. So they were the German airbrush technology was copying all sorts of forms and shapes. And with this, we conclude. We have Annaberg. We go from A to Z. An Annaberg picture on the left from the pattern, the mold design was called Emmy, E-M-M-Y. Many of the patterns in the design and the forms have either river names, city names, or people names, depending on the companies. And then you see the Annaberg, one of Annaberg's stamps. Below, you see the blind stamps for the numbers that the ceramics get before they're decorated, and then the black stencil that has A and ST and so forth. That is the decoration number that you see on the container on the left. And then we go to Z, which is Zell. So we go from Annaberg to Zell, A to Z, and we see two plates with patterns on them. All of these were in production between 1931 and 32, 33. And with that, I conclude. And if anybody has any questions, I'm glad to answer and try to answer. And that's the end of the talk.
Mute it. No, put the video back on.
Margaret, can you see this?
I can. I just got my little video back on there. That was fantastic. I have to ask you before we go to all the questions I'm sure you're going to get is
I don't see any questions because I'm not yeah.
I see the large array of things behind you, okay? How many pieces do you have in your collection? Since I feel like the reason none of the rest of us are ever going to see these is because you have all of them or they're in Germany.
Well, there's a big collection in Germany, in Hamburg, that has about 10,000 pieces.
Wow.
And then there's another, the German Ceramics Museum in Berlin has a few hundred, and I have a bit over 3,000 pieces.
Wow. So I would say that the degenerate dinnerware movement to destroy them wasn't terribly successful.
Well, people seem to have, that's a really good question because we've often, a couple of colleagues and I have often talked about this. It seems to have been successful at the factory level, that they went in and destroyed a lot of production. And they closed down the factory in 1936 and told them to destroy everything. But telling somebody to destroy something and then actually destroying it are two different things. So there were in the 1990s, in the 1980s and 1990s, and up to about 2010. So for roughly 25 years, there was an enormous amount of material available on flea markets and at auction houses that were in near mint, if not in mint condition. Now, whether these came from private homes where they were hidden in boxes in the dining room under the fine china that they put their Meissen out in front with all the little ornament on it, and then they put the abstract geometric non-objective stuff in the back. No one knows. But
So how many of the factories had their pattern books? You mentioned one that the pattern books survived. How many factories had that?
Four or five of the factories at the most have pattern books. And Karsten's, surprised because they sent out catalogs. They actually did color catalogs. There are a number of those that have survived, but they're by no means universal. That is, you can't study the whole thing by looking at all their pattern books and all their catalogs. I have a couple of the catalogs. They're in, they were offset color printed. And that gives you a hint, at least, of what was shown at the Great Trade Fair in Dresden in 1930 or 31. You know, the new line that was shown. But you don't find out what happened in 1933 or 34.
So how many tablecloths do you have that you know are meant to accompany some of these specific patterns?
There's three of them that really fit the patterns or accompany the color patterns. And then I have about another 35, 38 airbrushed tablecloths, and no one seems to know anything about them. I've talked with in Chemnitz, there's a big textile museum that collects tablecloths, among other things. They have a number of them in their collection. Chemnitz was Karl Marx-Stadt when it was East Germany, and it was a center of textile production. I've talked to a number of people there, and nobody knows who actually made these tablecloths. There are no signatures, no corporate identities, and so forth on any of the tablecloths.
Wow.
But they seem to have gone along with at least some of the tablecloths, a couple of them, seem to have gone along in color pattern with the ceramics because they're the same. And that brown I showed you one example of, there's about 150 different patterns in what's called Neubraun, a new brown. It's a real delicious looking brown. It's not a brown shirt brown, it's a different kind of brown.
So we have,
but it also disappears.
We have some questions that are coming in the chat, and if you have questions, you should direct the chat to Margaret Carney, and then we'll do our best to present your questions to Rolf to answer. So one question, you're looking at these pieces. It seems like there must have been a lot of complexity as far as the stencils and making stencils that would follow the curved shape and register different colors and stuff like that. Are any of the stencils still in existence?
Oh, that's a very good question, because yes, it's very complicated to do this, and they followed all the curves. The stencils were sometimes made of metal, but sometimes they were made of paper or a textile so that they could follow the curves properly. And there are probably 2 or 3 stencils that have survived.
2 or 3.
Yes.
Wow.
And they're metal, the ones that have survived. Because remember, Germany got hit very hard during World War II. And many of the factories were not making ceramics, but they were making war products at the time. And so the factories were destroyed and their inventory was destroyed, or they were firebombed, which was a popular type of bomb at the time. And the whole warehouse and the archives were destroyed. It happened to all sorts of companies, stained glass companies. they have one row of books that is fine and another row of books that is completely gone. So suddenly they have like 3 months of inventory, and then for 1 year and the whole next year, but nothing in between. Yeah.
So Rolf, can you tell people what your Facebook page is, that where if they want to learn more or they want to contact you?
Oh,
Can you write that in the chat or something?
They can contact. I have a Facebook page. It's Rolf Achilles. It's my name. And I occasionally show ceramics there, but most of the time, this month, I'm showing only work by women. So Eva Zeisel shows up and others, Sonia Delaney. And it's always my stuff. It's nobody else's stuff that I show. I took the picture so that I never show anybody else's picture. And if somebody else puts their picture up, I delete it.
So people want to know if you're going to do an exhibit or you're going to do a book or.
Yeah, my airbrush Facebook page is Spritzdekor Keramik. It's Spritzdekor Keramik. I can send that to you later. And I also have a website, which is German airbrushed ceramics.com. It's all one word, German airbrushed ceramics.com.
So the library is putting some of these websites into the chat.
Oh, okay.
So they should be showing up. Or at this point, your Facebook page is in the chat.
Oh, good. Yeah, again, on the Facebook page, the German airbrushed Facebook page is only stuff I have personally taken pictures of, and they're in my collection. So whatever you see there, sometimes I get comments and people send in their items that relate, beautiful items, but they're always in the comment section, not in the main section.
So another question with regard to the non-objective art and the degenerate dinnerware concept.
Yes.
Were there any consequences to the people who worked in the factory that produced the degenerate dinnerware?
Not really, unless they were Jewish. And then there were consequences just for being Jewish, as everybody knows. And a number of the Jewish factory owners left Germany by 1934, 33, 34. There have been some surveys done in the year beginning in the 1990s of the factory of women that worked in the factories. Most of the stencil work was made by women, and we don't know hardly any of the names of the designers of all these wonderful patterns and designs, but one can assume from the few names we do know that there were a lot of women involved. And the airbrush technology, there are a few photographs floating around of women airbrushing or people airbrushing, it's always a woman that's working the machine. Now, I don't know whether that was just to have a woman in the picture and so that you'd look at it instead of some guy standing there doing the same thing. But there were large groups of women in these small towns. And Hirschau they're all small towns. They're not in big cities, except for what happened in Dresden, for example. That was a big city. But Annaburg is a small town. Grünstadt is a small town. And and women were probably the majority of the technically able airbrush operators. And they made all these beautiful patterns, like the jug that I showed at the end there, with 3 or 4 or 5 different colors and different stencils. Complicated stuff.
And you mentioned that the Bauhaus didn't use the airbrush technique. Do you have any idea why that might have been?
Because it was mechanical and they were into non-mechanical. You hand through a pot, you use the pot on a wheel. All the ceramics I showed you here are cast. The Bauhaus didn't cast.
Okay.
Rolf, how did you get into this? What was your first piece and how did you start collecting and falling in love with this?
I saw an exhibit at the Cooper Hewitt from a German medievalist Tilman Budensiek. And academically, I'm a Byzantinist medievalist. And I knew Tilman Budensiek, and I saw his collection of all this ceramics at the Cooper Hewitt. This was in the late 80s. And I got interested in it. I wrote him, I got a copy of his catalog, the German copy of the catalog. And then I did a book called Made in Illinois in the late 1980s. And I traveled a lot in Illinois, and I always stopped at antique shops. And I saw occasionally, especially along the Mississippi and in Iowa, these strange little pots that had stenciled patterns on them. And I thought, oh, these are cute. And I would buy them for $1, $2. I'd haggle with somebody, you know, if it got over $1. And I ended up with a whole bunch of ceramics beginning about 1990, 92, and they were mostly Czech. And then I started looking on eBay, and I found numerous German examples, and then I met a couple of Germans, and I'm an honorary ambassador to the city of Hamburg. And so I went to Germany often, and I met with a number of the collectors and the dealers. And then I went to flea markets in Holland. Every time I was in Europe, I'd go flea marketing. And in Paris, I found wonderful dinner sets in Paris, just in antique shops. And we would all call the stuff Art Deco, but it was all made by Epiag, which was a consortium of Austrians and Czech airbrush ceramic companies that had airbrush patterns. And so I have complete dinner sets that I got in Paris. I'd have them packed up in a box, and I'd hand carry the box onto the airplane with me. In the days when you could still do that, and you could stash it in the plane. It didn't go through cargo, so nobody threw it around or anything.
So most of your collection came from Europe?
Yes, almost probably 80% of it. Interestingly enough, the West Coast, Portland, Oregon, and Seaside, Oregon, and Astoria in Washington, they had interesting collections out there, often Czech articles. Where they came from, I haven't a clue. But I ran into treasure troves out there where suddenly there would be a shop with 15 pieces, and I'd just wipe them out.
And everything you showed tonight was from your collection?
I'm sorry?
Everything you showed is from your collection?
Yes. I never show pictures of anybody else's stuff.
So you mentioned the degenerate aspect of it, and they were degenerate because they were associated with the Soviet Union. Is that because they were communist?
Two things. Non-objective is degenerate because it goes along with what the Soviets were calling simultaneous art, and it was Soviet inspired by Malevich and his suprematists. It was inspired by Kandinsky, who was thought to be a communist, even though he taught at the Bauhaus. And his everything that didn't have little kids in dirndls and jumping around a Christmas tree or something was considered degenerate. And the shapes of the pictures, the cocoa pictures I showed you, are not traditional shapes. What was considered by the National Socialists to be appropriate was what was common, traditional. They sound very much like, pardon the, I'm not going to say it, but in politics today, we have, this is not the standard we should be judging things by. You know, you can't introduce something new because it hasn't met the ancient filter, which is your opinion. And that's what National Socialism declared degenerate. So a book written that might be a little racy or have some thoughts in it that, like the Animal Farm or something, or something like that, would be degenerate. Dancing, the hoochie coochie, or jazz music, degenerate because it was by blacks who were degenerate by definition in 1936. So all these things fit together, and they were forms that the contemporaries did not think appropriate for the mass public, which they were now in charge of after 1933. The elections Hitler got 99, the German National Socialists got 99% of the vote in 1933 because of their economic policies. And then after they got the high vote, they ruled the country and they could do whatever they wanted to, and they did. And it was all perfectly legal because they changed the laws. And that's what happens. You change the laws and then you're not being illegal. It
So
happens often.
is there a book that you'd recommend if somebody wanted to learn more about this after this nice talk?
Well, not in English. There's very little in English written about any of ceramics. There is some German English book, but there was a big exhibit in Karlsruhe. That's sort of the last big exhibit. And it's the revolution of the patterns, the Revolution der Muster. And it's about the 1930s. It was a big exhibit in Karlsruhe that I went to see, and it was spectacular. And then there's a man in Hamburg who has been publishing on Karstens, the big company. And but his books are all in German. So everything is in German, Czech, a bit in the Portuguese have published a book about modernism ceramics in Portugal. And they copied a lot of German patterns. So that's in English. But they only published 400 copies of this catalog. So I think it's out of print.
Wow.
So it's an unknown entity. I need to do a book.
You do need to do a book. And do you have an exhibit coming up? Because it looks to me like you need to do a big exhibit too.
Well, I did one exhibit at the Armor Institute, it's IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, in their library, and a number of people came to see it, but it wasn't like it was a bestseller. And I can't get the Art Institute of Chicago interested. The Museum of Modern Art is not interested. The Cooper Hewitt would take a gift or two, but I'm not giving these things away. So there's no exhibit.
Is it fair to say that you have one of the largest collections in the world?
It's, yeah, for being as general, I cover lots of different companies. There are big collections that do only Annaberg, for example, or only Grünstadt. Every time I put up a Grünstadt platter or object on my Spritzdecor Facebook page, 750 to 800 people look at it within about 2 days.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, there's interest out there. Who are these people? I don't know them.
But one of the comments in the chat is someone who wanted to say hello to you.
Oh,
It's a fellow collector of Spritzdecor,
yes.
and you acquired a few of his pieces from me, or from him.
And
And I
does
think he's in Chicago, isn't he? Can I give his name? Is that this guy?
It's a man in Berwyn, maybe?
No, it's
A guy named Greg Alexander?
Oh, yeah, that was years ago. Yeah.
Well, he's watching.
Oh, hi, Greg. We haven't actually, I don't think we've actually met, but it was probably 15 years ago that, yeah, I bought some platters and pictures from him, and I know he has other pieces, but we should get together, chat. If you're in Chicago.
we've kind of reached the end of our normally allotted time, and the
Yes,
number of
yes.
comments have
Well, thank everybody.
gone down considerably.
And I did want to
Thank
give
you very much.
And I did want to give one quick shout out to Alan Bourgeois, who took a number of the photographs I showed. There's many of my photographs, but he did all the
Beautiful
other good ones.
photographs.
Yeah,
Your
he did all the good ones.
Your collection's very photogenic. So thank you very much, Rolf.
Thank you for the opportunity, Margaret. It's been a delight.
Thank you.